Hunger has a sound. It's not the growl people talk about in stories. It's quieter than that. It's the creak of an empty stomach settling into itself. The dry click of a throat swallowing nothing. The silence that fills a room when 20 children pretend they're not starving. Lydia Ralph knew that sound well. The orphan house sat at the edge of the lower district, a sagging building that smelled like boiled cabbage and damp wood. The walls were thin. The floors were colder. And the meals were small enough to fit in your palm if you pressed your fingers together. Lydia was 12 years old, and she had learned not to complain. Complaining didn't make the portions bigger. It didn't make the matron kinder. It just made you stand out, and standing out in a place like this meant trouble. So she stayed quiet. She kept her head down during meals, her hands folded in her lap until the bell rang. She ate slowly, chewing every bite until it dissolved on her tongue. She made her food last as long as possible, because once it was gone until tomorrow. And tomorrow always felt far away. The other children were loud. They shoved and argued and cried when their plates were empty. Lydia didn't judge them for it. She understood. Hunger made people desperate. But she had learned something else too. Hunger also made people invisible. If you were quiet enough, patient enough, the matron forgot you were there. If you didn't ask for more, she didn't notice when you slipped your portion to someone else. And Lydia had been doing that for 3 days now. The new boy arrived on a Tuesday. His name was Hobbs Richmond, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in weeks. He was thin in a way that made Lydia's chest ache. His clothes hung off his shoulders. His wrists were narrow as sticks. His eyes were dark and watchful, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. The matron shoved him toward an empty bed near the back of the dormitory and told him the rules in a bored voice. No fighting. No stealing. No crying after lights out. Hobbs didn't say a word. He just nodded and sat down on the edge of the mattress, his hands folded in his lap like he was trying to make himself smaller. Lydia watched him from across the room. She didn't know why, but something about him made her pause. Maybe it was the way he held himself, like he was used to being forgotten. Maybe it was the careful way he moved, like he was afraid to take up space. Or maybe it was the way his stomach growled so loud she could hear it from 10 feet away. Dinner that night was the same as always. A thin slice of bread. A cup of watery soup. A piece of fruit so bruised it was more brown than red. Lydia sat at the long wooden table with the other children and waited for the matron to ring the bell. When it came, everyone grabbed their plates. Lydia picked up her bread first. She tore it in half, then slipped one piece into the pocket of her dress when no one was looking. She ate the soup slowly, her eyes drifting toward the end of the table where Hobbs sat alone. His plate was in front of him, but he wasn't eating. He was staring at the bread like he was memorizing it. Lydia frowned. The other boys near him had already finished their portions and were licking their bowls clean. Hobbs hadn't touched his. She watched as one of the older boys, a thick-shouldered kid named Clyde Turlow, reached over and snatched the bread off Hobbs's plate. Hobbs didn't move. He didn't shout or grab it back. He just lowered his eyes and stared at the empty space where his food had been. Lydia's hands tightened around her spoon. Clyde laughed and stuffed the bread into his mouth, crumbs falling onto the table. The matron didn't notice. She never did. Lydia waited until the meal was over. Until the other children filed out of the dining hall and the matron disappeared into the kitchen. Then she walked over to where Hobbs was still sitting. He looked up at her, surprised. Lydia didn't say anything. She just pulled the piece of bread from her pocket and set it down in front of him. For a moment, Hobbs didn't move. He stared at the bread, then at her, his dark eyes wide and unreadable. You don't have to, he said quietly. His voice was rough, like he wasn't used to speaking. Lydia shook her head. I already ate, she lied. Hobbs looked at her for a long moment, and Lydia could see the question in his eyes. He didn't believe her. But he didn't argue either. He picked up the bread slowly, like it might disappear if he moved too fast. And then he ate. Lydia turned and walked away before he could say anything else. She didn't want his thanks. She didn't need it. She just didn't want him to go hungry. That night, Lydia's stomach ached. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried not to think about the bread she'd given away. It wasn't much. Just half a slice. But it was half a slice she wouldn't get back. She pressed a hand to her stomach and closed her eyes. It was worth it, she told herself. It had to be. The next morning, Hobbs was waiting for her near the water pump in the courtyard. Lydia stopped short when she saw him. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He looked nervous. "I wanted to say thank you," he said. Lydia shrugged. "It's fine." "It's not fine," Hobbs said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." Lydia looked at him for a moment, then turned toward the pump. "I know," she said simply. Hobbs followed her. "Why did you?" Lydia cranked the pump handle and let the cold water spill into the wooden bucket. "Because you were hungry," she said. Hobbs was silent for a moment. "So were you." Lydia didn't answer. She picked up the bucket and started back toward the orphan house, the water sloshing against the sides. Hobbs walked beside her, his steps careful and quiet. "One day," he said suddenly, "I'll be strong enough to protect you." Lydia glanced at him, surprised. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the ground, his jaw set. "I'm going to get out of here," he continued. "And when I do, I'll make sure no one ever takes anything from you again." Lydia didn't know what to say to that. It sounded impossible. Like a dream someone tells themselves to make the hunger easier. But the way Hobbs said it, quiet and steady, made her believe him. "Just a little." "Okay," she said softly. Hobbs looked at her then, and for the first time, he smiled. It was small, fragile, but real. And Lydia felt something warm settle in her chest. The days blurred together after that. Mornings came cold and grey. Afternoons stretched long and empty. Nights arrived too fast, and sleep never lasted long enough. But something had changed. Hobbs Richmond no longer sat alone. He sat across from Lydia during meals. He walked beside her when they carried water. He helped her scrub the floors when the matron assigned chores. He didn't say much. Neither did she. But the silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with understanding. Lydia continued to share her food. Not every day. Not every meal. But when she could, when no one was watching, she slipped him a piece of bread or a bite of fruit. Hobbs never asked for it. But he always took it. And every time, he looked at her like she'd just handed him the world. One evening, after the other children had gone to bed, Lydia and Hobbs sat on the back steps of the orphan house. The moon was high and pale, casting silver light across the overgrown yard. Hobbs leaned back against the railing, his arms crossed over his chest. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. Lydia pulled her knees to her chest. "Sometimes." "Where would you go?" She thought about it for a moment. "Somewhere quiet," she said. "Somewhere I don't have to worry about tomorrow." Hobbs nodded slowly. "I'm going to be someone important," he said. Lydia glanced at him. "Like a merchant?" Hobbs shook his head. "Bigger than that." "A king?" Hobbs didn't laugh. He just stared out at the yard, his expression serious. "Maybe," he said quietly. Lydia didn't know if he was joking or not. But she didn't laugh either. "If you become a king," she said, "you'll forget about this place." Hobbs turned to look at her, his eyes dark and steady. "I won't forget you." Lydia's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him. But she'd learned a long time ago that people didn't keep promises made in hunger. "You say that now," she said softly. "I mean it," Hobbs said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a smooth grey stone. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. Lydia frowned. "What is it?" "A promise," Hobbs said. "When I leave this place, I'm coming back for you. And when I do, you give this back to me." Lydia stared at the stone. It was small and ordinary. Nothing special. But the way Hobbs held it made it feel like something more. She took it carefully, her fingers closing around the cool surface. "Okay," she whispered. Hobbs smiled. And for the first time in a long time, Lydia felt hope. Winter came hard that year. The orphan house was colder than ever. The meals got smaller. The matron got meaner. Lydia's hands cracked from washing clothes in icy water. Her lips split from the dry air. Her stomach ached constantly. But she still shared her food with Hobbs. Even when it hurt. Even when her vision blurred from hunger. She couldn't explain why. It wasn't rational. It wasn't smart. But every time she saw him eat, every time his shoulders relaxed and his eyes softened, she felt like she'd done something right. One night, during the coldest week of the season, Lydia woke to the sound of coughing. She sat up in bed and looked around the dark dormitory. Most of the children were asleep, bundled under thin blankets. But Hobbs was sitting on the edge of his bed, his shoulders shaking. Lydia slipped out of bed and crossed the room quietly. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Hobbs looked up at her, his face pale in the moonlight. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice was rough. Lydia frowned. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. He was burning up. "You're sick," she said. "I'm fine," Hobbs repeated. Lydia didn't argue. She just sat down beside him and pulled her blanket off her own bed. She draped it over his shoulders. "You need it more than I do," she said. Hobbs started to protest, but Lydia shook her head. "Don't," she said quietly. "Just take it." Hobbs stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he pulled the blanket tighter around himself. "Thank you," he whispered. Lydia nodded. She stayed with him until his breathing evened out and he fell asleep. Then she went back to her own bed and shivered through the rest of the night. The next morning, Hobbs was gone. Lydia woke to the sound of the matron's voice. It was sharper than usual, cutting through the cold morning air like a blade. She sat up in bed and looked around the dormitory. The other children were already awake, whispering and pointing. Lydia's heart sank. Hobbs's bed was empty. His blanket was folded neatly at the foot of the mattress. His pillow was smooth and untouched. It looked like no one had slept there at all. Lydia scrambled out of bed and hurried toward the door. The matron was standing in the hallway, her arms crossed over her chest. "Where is he?" Lydia asked, her voice shaking. The matron looked at her with cold, uninterested eyes. "Who?" "Hobbs," Lydia said. "Hobbs Richmond." The matron's expression didn't change. "He's been adopted," she said flatly. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. "What?" "A family came for him last night," the matron continued. "They wanted a boy his age. He's gone." Lydia's hands clenched into fists. "Where did they take him?" "That's not your concern," the matron said. "Now get dressed and get to your chores." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Lydia stood frozen in place. Adopted. He was adopted. She should have been happy for him. She should have been relieved. But all she felt was hollow. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't tell her he was leaving. He just disappeared. Lydia went back to the dormitory and sat on the edge of her bed. Her hands shook as she reached into her pocket and pulled out the grey stone Hobbs had given her. She stared at it, her throat tight. "When I leave this place, I'm coming back for you." The words echoed in her mind, empty and meaningless now. He wasn't coming back. He was gone. And she was alone again. Days passed. Then weeks. Then months. Lydia stopped expecting him to return. She stopped looking for him in the courtyard. She stopped listening for his voice at meals. She convinced herself it was better this way. He had a family now. A real home. A future. He didn't need her anymore. And maybe he never really did. The orphan house felt emptier without him. Lydia went through the motions. She ate her small meals. She did her chores. She kept her head down. But something inside her had changed. The hope she'd felt sitting on those back steps with Hobbs was gone. And in its place was something colder. Something harder. She learned not to give her food away anymore. She learned not to trust promises. She learned that people left, and they didn't come back. Years passed. Lydia turned 13, then 14, then 15. The orphan house released her when she turned 16. They gave her a small bag of clothes, a few coins, and directions to the lower district. "Good luck," the matron said, without looking at her. Lydia walked out of the orphan house and didn't look back. She found work in a laundry house, scrubbing clothes for families who could afford to pay someone else to do it. The pay was small, but it was enough. She rented a room in a boarding house at the edge of the district. The walls were thin and the roof leaked, but it was hers. She didn't ask for more. She didn't expect more. She survived. And she told herself that was enough. But sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet and the stars were bright, she would pull the grey stone from her pocket and hold it in her palm. And she would wonder if Hobbs Richmond ever thought about her. Lydia Ralph was 22 years old, and she had built a life out of small things. A clean room. A steady job. A routine that kept her moving forward. She woke before sunrise every morning and walked to the laundry house where she worked. She scrubbed and rinsed and wrung out clothes until her hands were raw. She ate simple meals alone in her room. She saved every coin she could. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for help. She survived quietly, the way she always had. The lower district was loud and crowded and dirty. The streets smelled like smoke and spoiled food. The buildings leaned against each other like they were too tired to stand on their own. But Lydia didn't mind. She knew how to live in places like this. She knew how to be invisible. The other women at the laundry house were kind enough. They didn't ask too many questions. They didn't pry into her past. Lydia liked it that way. One afternoon, a woman named Pearl Voss came to the laundry house with a basket of clothes. She was older than Lydia, maybe in her 40s, with graying hair and tired eyes. "Can you have these ready by tomorrow?" Pearl asked. Lydia nodded. "Of course." Pearl smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "My husband's been sick. I've been trying to keep up with everything, but it's hard." Lydia took the basket and set it aside. "I'll make sure they're done," she said. Pearl hesitated, like she wanted to say something else. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a few extra coins. "For your trouble," she said. Lydia shook her head. "You don't have to do that." "I want to," Pearl said gently. Lydia looked at the coins, then at Pearl's worn hands. She could see the exhaustion in the woman's face. The weight of carrying too much for too long. "Keep it," Lydia said quietly. "You need it more than I do." Pearl's eyes filled with tears. "You're a good girl," she whispered. Lydia didn't know what to say to that. So she just nodded and turned back to her work. Pearl left, and Lydia finished the clothes by the next morning. She did it because she said she would. Not because she expected anything in return. That was how Lydia lived. She gave when she could. She helped when it was needed. She didn't expect gratitude or recognition. She just did what felt right. And somehow, it was enough. But there were nights when the loneliness pressed in on her like a weight. Nights when she sat in her small room and stared at the grey stone on her windowsill. She hadn't thrown it away. She didn't know why. Maybe because it was the only thing she had left from a time when she believed in promises. Or maybe because some small, stubborn part of her still hoped. Even if hoping hurt. One evening, Lydia was walking home from the laundry house when she heard shouting. She stopped and turned toward the sound. A group of men were gathered in the street, surrounding a young boy. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He was clutching a loaf of bread to his chest, his eyes wide with fear. "Give it back," one of the men snarled. "I didn't steal it," the boy cried. "Liar," another man spat. Lydia's chest tightened. She didn't know the boy. She didn't know the men. But she recognized the look in the boy's eyes. She'd worn that same look once. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward. "Leave him alone," she said. The men turned to look at her. One of them, a thick-shouldered man with a scarred face, sneered. "This doesn't concern you, girl." "He's just a child," Lydia said quietly. "He's a thief," the man said. "Did you see him steal it?" Lydia asked. The man hesitated. "He was running," he said. "That's not the same thing," Lydia said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a few coins. "Here," she said, holding them out. "This should cover the bread." The men stared at her. The scarred man frowned. "You're paying for him." "Yes," Lydia said simply. The man looked at the coins, then at the boy, then back at Lydia. Finally, he snatched the coins from her hand. "Fine," he muttered. "But if I catch him stealing again, there won't be anyone to save him." The men walked away, grumbling and cursing under their breath. Lydia turned to the boy. He was still clutching the bread, his hands shaking. "Are you okay?" she asked. The boy nodded slowly. "Thank you," he whispered. Lydia smiled faintly. "Go home," she said. "And be more careful." The boy hesitated, then ran off down the street. Lydia watched him go, her chest tight. She didn't regret helping him. But as she turned and continued toward her room, she couldn't help but think about how much easier it would have been to just walk away. To stay invisible. To keep her head down. But she couldn't. Because somewhere, buried deep inside her, was the girl who had given her food away to a starving boy. And that girl still believed in kindness. Even when the world didn't deserve it. The lower district was louder than usual that morning. Lydia heard the commotion before she saw it. Voices shouting. Footsteps pounding against cobblestones. The sharp clang of metal gates being drawn shut. She stepped out of the laundry house and frowned. The street was packed with people, all of them pressed against the walls and doorways. Royal guards stood in formation along the center of the road, their armor gleaming in the sunlight. Lydia's stomach tightened. Royalty didn't come to the lower district. Not unless something was very wrong. Or very important. She stayed near the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, and watched as the crowd murmured and whispered. "What's happening?" someone asked. "The Alpha King is here," another voice answered. Lydia's breath caught. The Alpha King. She'd heard stories about him. Everyone had. Hobbs Richmond. The orphan boy who had been adopted by a distant branch of the royal family. The boy who had risen through the ranks with ruthless efficiency. The boy who had claimed the throne 5 years ago and ruled with quiet, unyielding power. Lydia had told herself it couldn't be the same person. Hobbs Richmond was a common name. There were probably dozens of men with that name. It didn't mean anything. But as the guards parted and a tall figure stepped into view, Lydia's heart stopped. It was him. She would have recognized him anywhere. He was taller now, broader. His shoulders were strong and his posture was commanding. He wore a dark coat trimmed with silver, and a crown rested on his head like it had always belonged there. But his eyes were the same. Dark and watchful and full of something Lydia couldn't name. Hobbs Richmond, the Alpha King, walked slowly down the street. The crowd fell silent. Lydia pressed herself back against the wall, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't want him to see her. She didn't want him to recognize her. She just wanted to disappear. But Hobbs stopped in the middle of the street. His eyes scanned the crowd, slow and deliberate. And then they landed on her. Lydia's breath left her lungs. For a moment, neither of them moved. Hobbs stared at her like he was seeing a ghost. And Lydia stared back, frozen in place. Then, slowly, Hobbs took a step forward. The guards moved with him, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. But Hobbs raised a hand, and they stopped. He walked toward Lydia alone. The crowd parted for him, their whispers growing louder. Lydia's hands shook. She wanted to run. She wanted to hide. But her feet wouldn't move. Hobbs stopped in front of her. Up close, he was even more imposing. His presence filled the space between them, heavy and undeniable. But his voice, when he spoke, was soft. "Lydia." It wasn't a question. It was a recognition. A prayer. Lydia swallowed hard. "Your Majesty," she whispered. Hobbs's jaw tightened. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't call me that." Lydia didn't know what to say. She looked down at her hands, her throat tight. "I didn't know you'd be here," she managed. Hobbs let out a slow breath. "I've been looking for you," he said. Lydia's head snapped up. "What?" "For years," Hobbs continued. "I've been looking for you." Lydia stared at him, her chest aching. "Why?" Hobbs's expression softened. "Because I made you a promise," he said. Lydia's vision blurred. She shook her head. "That was a long time ago," she said. "You don't owe me anything." "I owe you everything," Hobbs said quietly. The crowd around them had gone completely silent. Lydia could feel their eyes on her, heavy and judgmental. She took a step back. "You should go," she said. "People are watching." Hobbs didn't move. "Let them watch," he said. Lydia's hands trembled. "You're the Alpha King," she said. "You can't just." "I can do whatever I want," Hobbs interrupted. "And what I want is to talk to you." Lydia looked up at him, her heart pounding. For a moment, she saw the boy he used to be. The quiet, hungry boy who had promised to come back for her. "Okay," she whispered. Hobbs's shoulders relaxed. He turned to the guards and gestured toward a building at the end of the street. "Clear it," he said. The guards moved immediately, their footsteps echoing as they swept through the building. Hobbs looked back at Lydia. "Come with me," he said gently. Lydia hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. And she followed the Alpha King inside. The building was small and empty. It had once been a merchant shop, but now it was just bare walls and dusty floors. The guards closed the door behind them, leaving Lydia and Hobbs alone. Lydia stood near the window, her arms wrapped around herself. Hobbs stood across from her, his hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Hobbs broke the silence. "They lied to me," he said quietly. Lydia looked at him, confused. "Who?" "The family who adopted me," Hobbs said. "They told me you were taken too. They said another family had come for you. They said you were safe." Lydia's breath caught. "That's not true," she whispered. "I know," Hobbs said, his voice rough. "I didn't find out until years later. By then, I didn't know where to start looking." Lydia's chest tightened. "So you did try," she said softly. Hobbs looked at her, his eyes dark and pained. "Of course I tried," he said. "Did you think I forgot you?" Lydia's throat closed up. She looked away, her vision blurring. "I thought you moved on," she admitted. "I thought you had a new life and I didn't fit into it anymore." Hobbs crossed the room in 3 long strides. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Lydia," he said quietly, "I never stopped thinking about you." Lydia's hands shook. "You became a king," she said. "You didn't need me." "I became a king because of you," Hobbs said. Lydia looked up at him, startled. Hobbs's expression was raw and open. "You fed me when I was starving," he said. "You gave me your blanket when I was sick. You saw me when no one else did." His voice cracked. "You made me believe I was worth something," he continued. "And I spent every day after that trying to become someone who deserved what you gave me." Lydia's tears spilled over. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, I did," Hobbs said. "Because you deserved someone who could protect you. Someone who could make sure you never went hungry again." Lydia shook her head. "I survived," she said. "I didn't need protecting." "I know," Hobbs said gently, "but I wanted to give it to you anyway." Lydia looked at him, her heart breaking and mending all at once. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come back now?" Hobbs hesitated. "Because I finally have the power to change things," he said. "And I wanted to use it to find you." Lydia's chest ached. "What if I don't want to be found?" she asked quietly. Hobbs's expression softened. "Then I'll leave," he said. "And I won't bother you again." Lydia stared at him. He meant it. She could see it in his eyes. If she asked him to go, he would. Even though it would hurt. Even though it would break him. But Lydia didn't want him to go. Not anymore. "I kept it," she said suddenly. Hobbs frowned. "Kept what?" Lydia reached into her pocket and pulled out the grey stone. Hobbs's eyes widened. Lydia held it out to him, her hand trembling. "You told me to give it back to you," she said softly, "when you came back for me." Hobbs stared at the stone, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached out and closed her hand around it. "Keep it," he said quietly. "I don't need it anymore." Lydia looked up at him, confused. "Why?" Hobbs smiled faintly. "Because I found you," he said. "The promise is already kept." Lydia's tears fell freely now. She didn't try to stop them. Hobbs reached up and gently wiped them away with his thumb. "I'm sorry," he said. "For leaving. For not finding you sooner." Lydia shook her head. "You're here now," she whispered. Hobbs's smile widened. "I am," he said. And for the first time in years, Lydia let herself believe in promises again. The days that followed felt like a dream. Hobbs didn't leave the lower district right away. He stayed in a guarded building near the center of the district, and he asked Lydia to visit him every day. At first, Lydia resisted. She didn't want people to talk. She didn't want to be seen as someone who was using the Alpha King for personal gain. But Hobbs was persistent. And eventually, Lydia stopped saying no. They talked for hours. About the orphan house. About the years they'd spent apart. About the lives they'd built in the spaces between then and now. Hobbs told her about the family who had adopted him. About the brutal training he'd endured. About the political battles he'd fought to claim the throne. Lydia told him about the laundry house. About the people she'd helped. About the quiet, simple life she'd carved out for herself. And slowly, the gap between them began to close. But there was still something unspoken between them. Something heavy and unavoidable. One evening, as they sat together in the empty building, Hobbs finally said it out loud. "I want you to come with me," he said. Lydia looked at him, her heart pounding. "Where?" "To the palace," Hobbs said. "I want you to live there. With me." Lydia's breath caught. "Hobbs, I can't." "Why not?" Hobbs interrupted. Lydia stood up, her hands shaking. "Because I don't belong there," she said. "I'm not royalty. I'm not noble. I'm just—" "You're Lydia," Hobbs said firmly. "And that's all that matters to me." Lydia shook her head. "It's not that simple," she said. "You have responsibilities, expectations, people who depend on you." Hobbs stood and crossed the room toward her. "I know," he said quietly, "but I don't care." Lydia looked up at him, her chest tight. "You should care," she said. "You're the Alpha King. You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want," Hobbs said. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "Not if it means losing everything you've worked for," she said. Hobbs's jaw tightened. "You think I worked for this?" he asked. "For the crown? For the title?" He stepped closer. "I worked for you," he said. "To become someone who could stand beside you. To become someone who could give you the life you deserve." Lydia's tears spilled over. "I don't need a palace," she whispered. "I don't need riches or power. I just need—" She stopped, her voice breaking. Hobbs reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands. "What do you need?" he asked softly. Lydia looked into his eyes, her heart aching. "I need you to be happy," she said. "Even if that means letting me go." Hobbs's expression shattered. "Lydia," he said, his voice rough. "I could have everything in the world, and it wouldn't mean anything without you." Lydia closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "Then what do we do?" she whispered. Hobbs pressed his forehead against hers. "We find a way," he said. "Together." Lydia's breath hitched. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe they could make this work. But she knew the world didn't care about what they wanted. "The council won't accept me," she said quietly. "Then I'll change the council," Hobbs said. "The nobles will resist. Let them. The people will talk." Hobbs pulled back slightly, his eyes burning with determination. "Let them talk," he said. "I don't care what they think. I care about you." Lydia stared at him, her heart breaking and healing all at once. "You're willing to fight the entire kingdom for me?" she asked. Hobbs smiled faintly. "I'd burn it to the ground if I had to," he said. Lydia let out a shaky laugh. "That's a terrible thing to say," she whispered. "I know," Hobbs said. "But it's true." Lydia looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. Hobbs's eyes widened. "Okay." Lydia smiled through her tears. "I'll come with you," she said. "But not because you're the Alpha King." Hobbs's expression softened. "Then why?" Lydia reached up and placed her hand over his heart. "Because you're the boy who promised to come back for me," she said. "And you kept that promise." Hobbs's smile was brighter than the sun. He pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. And for the first time in years, Lydia felt safe. 2 days later, Hobbs announced his intentions to the council. He told them he was bringing Lydia Ralph to the palace. He told them she would be under his protection. He told them anyone who questioned his decision would answer to him personally. The council was silent. The nobles whispered. But no one dared to challenge the Alpha King. And when Lydia walked through the palace gates for the first time, Hobbs was waiting for her. He took her hand gently, his eyes full of warmth. "Welcome home," he said. Lydia looked up at him, her heart full. "Thank you," she whispered. And as they walked into the palace together, Lydia realized something. The promise made in hunger had survived. It had survived years of separation. It had survived doubt and fear and loneliness. And now, finally, it had come true. Not because Hobbs was powerful. Not because he was a king. But because he remembered kindness. And because love, real love, never forgot.